There is a rule in the ocean that nobody expected to find, and that took decades of deep-sea exploration to fully appreciate. The rule is simple to state and strange to contemplate. The deeper you go, the bigger things get. Not always, not every species, not in every part of the ocean, but as a general pattern, as a tendency that shows up again and again across wildly different animal groups in wildly different parts of the deep sea, it is real. It has a name: deep sea gigantism. And once you start looking for it, you find it everywhere. The surface ocean does not prepare you for this. The animals you encounter in the sunlit shallows, the fish in a reef, the crabs in a tide pool, the shrimp in a fisherman's net are small, manageable, sized in ways that feel intuitive and familiar. A crab is something you can hold in your hand. A shrimp is something you can fit on a fork. A fish is something a larger fish can swallow. The surface ocean operates on a scale that feels, if not exactly human, at least comprehensible. Then you descend, and the scale begins to change. Slowly at first, then faster, then in ways that stop making sense by any surface world logic. And the question of why this happens, why the deep ocean produces animals of sizes that seem almost impossible from the perspective of the surface world, turns out to be one of the most interesting questions in marine biology. If you enjoy drifting into the deep ocean and discovering what lies beneath, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Are you ready? Let's begin. The answer begins with a paradox. The deep ocean is, by almost every metric, a hostile environment for large animals. Food is scarce. Energy is expensive. The temperature is near freezing. The pressure would kill a surface organism instantly. There is no sunlight, which means no photosynthesis, which means the entire food web depends on whatever organic matter rains down from above. By every reasonable expectation, an environment this resource poor should produce small, energy-efficient organisms that minimize their metabolic needs and survive on as little as possible. And in some cases, it does. But in others, it produces the opposite. Animals of extraordinary size that seem to contradict the logic of their environment. Understanding why requires understanding what the deep ocean actually does to biology and what biology has done in response over millions of years of evolution. The first piece of the puzzle is temperature. Cold water slows metabolism. This is a basic principle of biochemistry. The rate of chemical reactions decreases as temperature drops. At the temperatures found in the deep ocean, typically between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius, the metabolic rate of an organism is a fraction of what it would be in warm surface water. A lower metabolic rate means that an organism burns energy more slowly. And an organism that burns energy more slowly can survive on less food. But it also means that growth is slower, reproduction is slower, and lifespan is longer. Deep-sea organisms tend to live far longer than their surface-dwelling relatives. And longer life means more time to grow. A Japanese spider crab in warm, shallow water might live for a few years. The same species in colder water at the edge of its range can live for decades, and it keeps growing throughout its life. Time in the deep ocean is one resource that is not scarce. The cold provides it in abundance. The second piece is oxygen. This seems counterintuitive because oxygen levels in the deep ocean are actually variable, and in some depth zones there are oxygen minimum zones where dissolved oxygen drops to very low levels. But at greater depths, below these minimum zones, oxygen levels recover somewhat because the cold, dense water that sinks from the polar regions carries dissolved oxygen with it. The relationship between oxygen and body size in aquatic organisms is complex, but one factor that limits size in warmer, shallower water is the difficulty of getting enough oxygen to support a large body through diffusion across body surfaces. In colder water, oxygen dissolves more readily, and the lower metabolic demands of a cold organism mean that less oxygen is needed per unit of body mass. This removes one of the constraints on size that operates in the warm, shallow ocean. The third piece is pressure. High pressure does strange things to biology, and most of those things are negative. It denatures proteins. It rigidifies cell membranes. It compresses gas-filled spaces. Deep-sea organisms have evolved elaborate biochemical solutions to these problems. Solutions that work, but that come with their own costs. One hypothesis about deep-sea gigantism is that some of the molecular solutions to pressure tolerance, particularly the accumulation of certain osmolytes and structural proteins, may also have effects on cell size and body size as byproducts of their primary function. This is not fully established, but it is a plausible contributor to the size patterns we observe. The fourth piece, and in some ways the most important, is food scarcity. This one seems like it should work against large body size. Larger animals need more food. If food is scarce, smaller animals that need less should have the advantage. And this is true in the short term. But in the long term, over evolutionary time, food scarcity produces a different selection pressure. When food arrives unpredictably, in pulses rather than steadily, the organisms that can store the most energy when food is available and survive the longest between meals have the advantage. Larger body size means more storage capacity. A larger animal can accumulate fat reserves during a feast that will sustain it through a much longer famine. The deep ocean, where organic matter rains down in irregular pulses determined by events at the surface kilometers above, selects for exactly this kind of feast and famine physiology. Size, in this context, is not a liability. It is a survival strategy. There is also the matter of predator-prey dynamics. In the surface ocean, size is a double-edged attribute. Being large makes you harder to eat, but it also makes you more visible, more energetically expensive to maintain, and in some cases, slower and less maneuverable than smaller predators. The cost-benefit calculation of size is complicated by the density of predators and competitors in the sunlit zone. In the deep ocean, where predator density is lower and visibility is zero regardless of size, some of these costs are reduced. Being large is more purely advantageous because the disadvantages of visibility and conspicuousness do not apply in absolute darkness. size becomes a more purely advantageous trait. The evolutionary calculus shifts. All of these factors, temperature, oxygen, pressure, food scarcity, predator dynamics, act together to produce the phenomenon of deep-sea gigantism. But they do not act equally at all depths or in all groups of organisms. The result is not a simple linear relationship between depth and size. It is a complex, patchy pattern in which certain groups show dramatic size increases with depth while others do not, and in which the largest animals at any given depth zone are the products of specific evolutionary histories that have made them particularly responsive to one or more of the factors above. The pattern is real. The mechanism is multifactorial. And the examples as you descend through the water column are extraordinary. The first example, the one that sits closest to the surface and therefore closest to the familiar world, is the Japanese spider crab. Macrochera campheri is the largest arthropod on Earth. Arthropods are the group that includes all insects, all spiders, all crustaceans, every animal with an exoskeleton and jointed legs, a group that contains more species than all other animal groups combined. And the largest of all of them lives in the ocean off the coast of Japan. An adult male Japanese spider crab can reach a leg span of 3.7 meters from the tip of one claw to the tip of the opposite claw. Its body, the central carapace, is not enormous, roughly the size of a basketball. But those legs, long and spindly and jointed in ways that seem almost architectural, extend outward in a span that is wider than most cars are long. It weighs up to 19 kilograms. It can live for 100 years. It keeps growing throughout its entire life, molting its exoskeleton periodically and expanding into a new, larger one, a process that becomes increasingly infrequent and increasingly dangerous as the animal ages, because a newly molted crab is soft and vulnerable until the new shell hardens. The Japanese spider crab lives primarily at depths between 150 and 800 meters, in the cold, dark waters of the Pacific, off the coasts of Japan and Taiwan. It is a scavenger and an opportunistic omnivore, consuming whatever organic matter it can find on the seafloor: dead fish, mollusks, plant material, other crustaceans. Its size gives it an advantage in accessing food sources that smaller animals cannot reach, and in defending those food sources against competitors. Its longevity means that a single individual can accumulate decades of experience with its environment, learning, in whatever sense a crustacean can learn, where food tends to appear and when. It is not the deepest dwelling giant in the ocean. It is not even close. But it is the first one you encounter as you descend, the first indication that the rules of size in the ocean are not the rules of the surface world. And it sets up a question that every subsequent depth zone will answer with something larger and stranger. If this is what the shallow cold water produces, what does the real deep produce? The Japanese spider crab is not an accident. It is the product of a specific evolutionary trajectory that began with a much smaller ancestor and proceeded over millions of generations in the direction of increasing size, because size, in its particular environment, paid off. Its relatives, the other spider crabs of the family Magidae, are found throughout the world's oceans at a range of depths, and the pattern within the family is consistent. The species that live in colder, deeper water tend to be larger than those that live in warmer, shallower water. This is deep sea gigantism operating within a single family, visible as a gradient across related species rather than as a sudden jump between unrelated ones. It is evolution following the same logic at multiple scales simultaneously. The crab also illustrates something important about how deep-sea giants interact with the surface world. Macrochera caempheri is caught in commercial fisheries, primarily during the winter months when it migrates to shallower water to breed. It appears in Japanese fish markets and in aquariums around the world. It is, in that sense, a known quantity, an animal that humanity has been eating and observing for centuries. And yet its biology, the mechanisms that produce its extraordinary size and longevity, is still not fully understood. The basic facts of its life history, how it finds mates in the dark at depth, how its larvae survive in the plankton before settling to the bottom, how its growth rate changes across its century-long lifespan, are known in outline but not in detail. It is one of the most visible of the deep-sea giants, and still one of the least understood. This is a theme that runs through the entire story of deep-sea gigantism. The animals exist. They have been observed, measured, occasionally captured. But the details of their lives, how they reproduce, how they navigate, how they find food in the dark, how they interact with each other and with their environment, remain largely mysterious. The deep ocean is not a place that yields its secrets easily. Observation requires equipment that is expensive and difficult to operate. The animals themselves are often damaged or killed by the process of being brought to the surface for study. The pressures and temperatures that constitute their normal environment cannot be maintained in a laboratory setting without extraordinary effort. And so the giants of the deep ocean exist in a peculiar epistemic state. We know they are there. We know roughly how large they get. We know something about what they eat and where they live. And beyond that, for most species, we are largely in the dark, which is fitting in a way. The deep ocean has always kept its largest inhabitants in the dark. It keeps us there too. What we do know is that the Japanese spider crab is only the beginning of the size gradient. It lives at the upper edge of what we might call the deep ocean, the zone where the effects of depth on body size are just beginning to be felt. As you descend further into the zones where sunlight is gone entirely and the pressure begins to mount in earnest, the creatures you encounter are not merely larger. They are larger in ways that seem to belong to a different biological reality entirely. The deep ocean does not simply scale up the familiar. It produces things that have no equivalent at the surface. Things that could not exist at the surface. Things that the surface world's rules of size and form and function simply do not accommodate. And to find them, you have to keep going down. There is one more aspect of the Japanese spider crab that deserves attention before we leave it behind, because it speaks to something fundamental about how deep-sea giants relate to the ocean system as a whole. The crab's extraordinary leg span is not purely a function of its body's need for support or locomotion. At 150 to 800 meters depth, The water provides buoyancy that makes the mechanical demands on those legs far less than they would be in air. A creature with a 3.7-meter leg span could not support itself on land. The exoskeleton would buckle under its own weight. But in water, particularly in cold, dense water, the buoyancy offsets much of the gravitational load. The ocean enables a scale of construction that the terrestrial world forbids. This is why the largest animals in Earth's history have all been aquatic. The blue whale, the largest animal known to have ever existed, would collapse under its own weight if removed from the water. The ocean is a medium that permits size in a way that air and land do not. And the deep ocean, with its cold, dense water and its low metabolic demands, permits size beyond even what the surface ocean allows. What you find as you descend is not merely an extension of the surface world's biology. It is biology operating in a medium that has different physical rules, producing different outcomes, following different logic. The deeper you go, the more those differences accumulate, and the creatures that result are the proof. The Japanese spider crab has been sitting at the edge of the deep for 100 million years in one form or another. While the continents shifted around it and the climate changed and species came and went above and below it, it has found its size and kept it, refined it, made it work in its particular slice of the water column. It is, in its way, a solved problem. Evolution found the answer for this depth, this temperature, this food availability, this pressure. And the answer was very large, very slow, very patient, and very long-lived. The same answer, it turns out, that the deep ocean gives again and again at depth after depth to group after group of animals that had no common ancestor anywhere near as recent as you might expect. The rule is real. The deeper you go, the bigger things get, and the deeper you go from here, the more emphatically the ocean makes that point. Before we descend, it is worth pausing on a number that puts the scale of deep-sea gigantism into perspective. The Japanese spider crab, at 3.7 meters of leg span, is the largest arthropod alive today. But it is not the largest arthropod that has ever lived. In the Paleozoic era, between roughly 460 and 250 million years ago, a group of aquatic arthropods called eurypterids, sometimes called sea scorpions, reached lengths of up to 2.5 meters. They were not deep-sea animals. They lived in shallow, coastal, and freshwater environments, and they were enormous by the standards of their time, apex predators in the ecosystems they inhabited. The eurypterids went extinct at the end of the Permian in the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. The Japanese spider crab survived in various ancestral forms through multiple extinction events and sits today as the largest living arthropod on a planet where arthropods represent the majority of animal species. Its size is not a fluke. It is the result of an evolutionary process that has been running under the influence of the same deep ocean physical factors we have been discussing for a very long time. Longer than humans have existed. Longer than mammals have existed. The deep ocean has been producing giants since before the dinosaurs. It has not stopped. And as you descend below the depth where the Japanese spider crab lives, into zones where the pressure doubles and then doubles again, and the temperature drops toward freezing, and the last trace of sunlight is so remote as to be meaningless, the giants only get stranger. The crab was the first word in a sentence the ocean has been writing for millions of years. The next words are stranger, and they require going much deeper. At 200 meters, the last usable sunlight disappears, not gradually, not in a slow fade that gives your eyes time to adjust, but in a way that is absolute and final. One moment, there is blue. Then there is nothing. This boundary has a name in oceanography. The photic zone ends here, and the mesopelagic zone begins, the twilight zone. It extends from 200 meters down to roughly 1,000 meters, and it is one of the most biologically productive regions in the ocean, despite the fact that no photosynthesis occurs within it. The animals that live here do not produce their own energy from sunlight. They hunt, they scavenge, they migrate vertically every day, ascending toward the surface at night to feed in the plankton-rich shallows and descending back into the dark during the day to avoid predators. And some of them are very, very large. The oarfish is the longest bony fish on Earth. Regalecus glesnae can reach a verified length of 8 meters, and there are credible reports of individuals exceeding 11 meters. Its body is ribbon-shaped, laterally compressed to near flatness, silvery and iridescent, with a bright red dorsal fin that runs the entire length of its body from head to tail like a rooster's comb. It has no scales. Its flesh is gelatinous and largely inedible, which is one of the reasons it is rarely seen by fishermen. It lives primarily in the mesopelagic zone, descending to at least 1,000 meters, possibly deeper. Almost everything known about it comes from specimens that have washed ashore, dead or dying, or from the very few encounters that ROVs have had with living individuals in the deep. What those encounters have revealed is an animal that is stranger in life than anyone expected from the dead specimens. A living oarfish does not swim horizontally the way most fish do. It hangs in the water column vertically, its long body oriented straight up and down, its red dorsal fin rippling in slow undulations that keep it stationary with minimal energy expenditure. Its eyes, which are large and yellow irised, point upward, scanning the dim water above for the silhouettes of prey against whatever faint light filters down from the surface. When prey comes within range, the oarfish strikes upward with a protrusible mouth that extends forward in a rapid lunge. This hunting posture, vertical, still, patient, is completely unlike anything seen in shallow water fish. It is a posture adapted to the specific conditions of the mesopelagic zone, where the energy cost of constant swimming would be prohibitive, and where the faint downwelling light makes upward-looking eyes more useful than forward-looking ones. The oarfish's extraordinary length is almost certainly a product of the same suite of factors that produces deep-sea gigantism more generally: cold water, slow metabolism, long lifespan, the ability to grow continuously over decades. But there is something specific about its ribbon-like body plan that is worth considering separately. A ribbon-shaped body of 8 to 11 meters represents a radically different solution to the problem of being large in the deep ocean than a spherical or torpedo-shaped body of equivalent mass. The ribbon maximizes surface area relative to volume. This has implications for how the animal senses its environment, for how water flows past its body as it hangs in the column, possibly for how it detects pressure changes or chemical gradients associated with prey. The oarfish's shape is not simply a fish that got longer. It is a fundamentally different body plan, one that evolution has refined specifically for the conditions of the mesopelagic zone. The oarfish is almost certainly the origin of sea serpent legends in cultures with access to the ocean. A dead or dying oarfish washing ashore, its silver body gleaming, its red crest erect, its enormous length stretched across a beach, would have been genuinely inexplicable to anyone who encountered it before the era of systematic marine biology. It looks like nothing else. It looks like something that should not exist. And sailors who encounter living individuals at the surface, which oarfish sometimes visit when they are sick or dying, would have seen something that their categories had no place for. A serpentine creature of impossible length, silver and red, moving through the water with sinuous undulations. The sea serpent was real. It was just a fish. The oarfish washes ashore rarely, but when it does, the event makes news. This is partly because of its size, and partly because in several East Asian cultural traditions, an oarfish appearing at the surface is considered an omen of earthquakes. The connection is not entirely without basis. Oarfish live at depths where they may be sensitive to changes in seafloor geology, to the pressure waves of seismic activity propagating through the water column, to disturbances in the chemical and physical gradients of the deep water. Whether they actually respond behaviorally to pre-seismic signals is not established scientifically, but the correlation between oarfish strandings and subsequent earthquakes has been noted often enough that Japanese researchers have studied it formally. The results are inconclusive. The ocean keeps its own counsel on the matter. What is clear is that the oarfish has been appearing at the surface and dying on beaches for as long as people have been watching the ocean. And for most of that time, it was a mystery so complete that mythology was the only available framework for understanding it. The science came later. The size was always there, waiting to be explained. The mesopelagic zone also contains the giant larvation, Bathocordeus charon, which is one of the more conceptually strange animals in the deep ocean. Larvaceans are tunicates, animals related to sea squirts, and, more distantly, to vertebrates, including humans. They build around themselves a structure called a house, a bubble of mucus secreted by the animal itself, through which they filter seawater for food particles. The house of Bathocordeus charon can reach 1 meter in diameter. The animal inside it is only a few centimeters long. The house is the giant. It is a structure made entirely of mucus, transparent and fragile, that the larvation builds, uses, and then discards when it becomes clogged with particles, sinking to the seafloor as what researchers have called a ghost palace. These discarded houses, sinking through the water column, carry with them a concentrated package of organic material, the particles trapped in the mucus filters, that represents a significant contribution to the biological pump that moves carbon from the surface to the deep. The giant larvation is not just an animal. It is an ecosystem service, a carbon transport mechanism, a ghost palace factory operating continuously in the twilight zone. The Humboldt squid, Dosidicus gigas, occupies a different niche in the mesopelagic zone and represents a different expression of deep-sea gigantism. It reaches lengths of up to 2 meters and weights of up to 50 kilograms. It is a voracious predator, hunting in coordinated groups of hundreds or thousands of individuals, using bioluminescent flashes to communicate and coordinate attacks on schools of fish. Its beak is strong enough to cut through the bones of its prey. Its arms and tentacles are lined with suckers ringed with sharp teeth. It can change color almost instantaneously, using chromatophores in its skin to produce patterns that may signal aggression, submission, or hunting intent to other members of its group. The Humboldt squid is an animal that hunts collectively, communicates in light, and can strip a school of fish in minutes. It is found primarily in the eastern Pacific, but its range has been expanding in recent decades as ocean temperatures change, and it is increasingly encountered in waters where it was previously unknown. The mesopelagic zone is, in many ways, the most poorly understood part of the ocean. It is too deep for easy sampling from the surface, but not deep enough to be the focus of the specialized extreme depth technology that has been developed for hadal exploration. The nets used to sample it are too coarse to capture small organisms without destroying them, and too slow closing to prevent larger, faster animals from escaping. Acoustic surveys suggest that the mesopelagic zone contains an enormous biomass of fish and other animals. Estimates range from 1 billion to 10 billion tons of fish alone, which would make it by far the largest reservoir of fish biomass on Earth, exceeding all surface fisheries combined. But direct confirmation of these estimates is difficult, and the species composition of this biomass is poorly known. The twilight zone hides behind its depth and its darkness, yielding information reluctantly, keeping most of its giants unobserved and uncounted. What the mesopelagic zone does for the rest of the ocean is substantial. The daily vertical migration of its inhabitants, billions of animals ascending to the surface at night and descending again by day, constitutes the largest migration on Earth, measured by biomass. These animals feed at the surface and excrete at depth, transferring enormous quantities of organic carbon from the sunlit zone to the deep in their bodies and their waste products. This active transport of carbon supplements the passive sinking of marine snow and represents a significant component of the biological pump. Remove the mesopelagic animals from the ocean system, and the efficiency of carbon sequestration in the deep would drop substantially. The giants of the twilight zone are not merely curiosities of evolution. They are functional components of the global carbon cycle. The giants of the mesopelagic zone, the oarfish with its impossible length, the larvation with its mucus palace, the Humboldt squid with its collective intelligence, all represent deep-sea gigantism operating in a zone that still has some connection to the surface world. The daily migration brings them briefly into contact with sunlit water. The food they consume is ultimately derived from surface photosynthesis. They live at the boundary between the familiar and the alien. But the boundary is not stable. As you descend below 1,000 meters, the last of those connections weaken and then break entirely. The migrators stop coming. The light, even the faintest trace of it, is gone for good. And the animals you find below that line have not seen the surface in any meaningful sense for their entire evolutionary history. They are creatures of pure darkness, and they are larger than anything in the twilight zone above them. The vertical migration of mesopelagic animals is worth dwelling on because it is one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the ocean and one of the least appreciated by people who do not study it. Every evening, as light fades at the surface, billions of individual animals, fish, squid, crustaceans, jellyfish, begin ascending from depths of 200 to 1,000 meters toward the surface. The ascent takes hours. They feed through the night in the relatively food-rich surface waters, then descend again before dawn to escape the visual predators of the sunlit zone. This migration happens every day, everywhere in the ocean where mesopelagic animals exist, which is most of the ocean. It is the largest coordinated movement of biomass on Earth, larger than any terrestrial migration by orders of magnitude, and it happens invisibly, underwater, twice every day without pause. The energetic cost of this migration is enormous. An animal ascending 500 meters vertically every evening and descending again every morning is doing significant physical work that requires food to fuel. This is one reason why mesopelagic animals tend to be efficient with body plans and metabolic strategies optimized for the energy demands of vertical travel. The oarfish's hanging posture conserves energy during the day. The humboldt squid's jet propulsion is powerful but expensive, which is one reason they hunt in groups rather than alone. Every adaptation in the mesopelagic zone is, in some sense, an adaptation to the energy budget imposed by the migration. The giant larvacean's mucus house is perhaps the most elegant solution to this energy problem. The animal does not chase food. It builds a trap and lets the ocean deliver food to it. The house filters particles from the water passively, requiring no active swimming or hunting. When the filters clog, the animal abandons the house and builds a new one, a process that takes only hours. The energy cost of building a mucus structure is far lower than the energy cost of active predation, and the return, a constant stream of food particles delivered by the ocean's currents, is reliable. The giant larvacean has essentially outsourced the work of finding food to the physics of fluid dynamics. In an environment where energy is a limiting resource, this is a profound competitive advantage. What the mesopelagic zone teaches, if you pay attention to it, is that gigantism in the deep ocean is not a single strategy. It is a collection of strategies, each one adapted to a specific set of conditions, each one solving the problem of being large in a low-energy environment in a different way. The oarfish is large and passive, minimizing energy expenditure through a specialized posture and hunting behavior. The humboldt squid is large and active, compensating for its high energy demands through social hunting that increases efficiency. The giant larvacean is large only in the sense that its external structure is large, while the animal inside remains small, a strategy that decouples the benefits of large-scale filter feeding from the metabolic costs of maintaining a large body. These are not variations on a single theme. They are independent solutions to related problems arrived at by different evolutionary pathways over different timescales. This diversity of solutions becomes even more striking When you consider that the mesopelagic zone is, in evolutionary terms, a relatively accessible environment, animals from the surface have repeatedly colonized it throughout the history of the ocean. The oarfish's ancestors were shallower water fish. The squid's ancestors were surface predators. The larvacean's body plan is ancient and conservative. These animals came from above and went deeper, finding in the twilight zone conditions that, while challenging, were not entirely alien. The animals that live below 1,000 meters have a different history. Many of them have never had ancestors in the surface ocean, not for tens or hundreds of millions of years. They are native to the dark, and their bodies show it in ways that the mesopelagic giants, which retain some surface world features, do not. To find those bodies, to understand what the deep ocean produces when it has had uninterrupted time to work on a lineage, you have to cross the 1,000-meter line and keep going. There is one more creature of the mesopelagic zone that deserves mention before we descend, not because of its size, which is moderate, but because of what it reveals about how the twilight zone shapes perception and behavior in ways that have no surface equivalent. The bristlemouth fish, family Gonostomatidae, is probably the most abundant vertebrate on Earth. Estimates of their total population run to the hundreds of trillions. They are small, typically 2 to 5 centimeters long, with rows of tiny bioluminescent organs along their bellies called photophores. These photophores produce a faint, downwelling light that matches the dim glow filtering from above, making the fish nearly invisible to predators looking upward from below. This counter-illumination camouflage is one of the most elegant adaptations in the mesopelagic zone. The fish uses light to become invisible in a world where the only light is bioluminescence. The bristlemouth is not a giant, but its abundance matters enormously to the giants that share its zone. The Humboldt squid feeds on it. The oarfish may feed on it. The thousands of other mesopelagic predators that we have not yet mentioned depend on it. The bristlemouth is the biomass that underlies the twilight zone's food web, the fuel on which the giants run. Without the bristlemouths and their trillion-strong population, the oarfish would have nothing to hunt. The Humboldt squid would have nothing to coordinate its attacks against. The twilight zone would be a far emptier place, the smallest vertebrate on Earth and the largest, both living in the same darkness, both invisible in their own way. This is what the mesopelagic zone is, ultimately, a zone of extremes existing simultaneously, abundant and sparse, visible and invisible, giant and minute. A zone that connects the surface world to the deep in ways that are not obvious from either end, but that are essential to the function of the entire ocean. The daily migration is the pump. The giants are the pumpers. And everything they move, every carbon molecule transferred from surface to deep in their bodies and their waste, is a transaction that has been running since before human beings existed and that will continue long after we are gone. The twilight zone does not need us to understand it to function, but understanding it changes how you think about the ocean and about the giants that the deep ocean produces when it has even more time and even more pressure and even more darkness to work with. The 1,000-meter line is not an ending. It is a threshold. Cross it, and the size of what you find stops being surprising and starts being something closer to incomprehensible. Below 1,000 meters, the ocean changes in a way that is not merely a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. The mesopelagic zone, for all its darkness and pressure, still has a relationship with the surface. Its animals migrate. Its chemistry is influenced by the downwelling of surface water. Its food arrives regularly enough to sustain the enormous biomass of the twilight zone. Below 1,000 meters, those connections attenuate. The daily migration stops. The water has been circulating through the deep for centuries without touching the surface. The food that arrives has already been processed and reprocessed by everything above. This is the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone, and it extends from 1,000 meters to roughly 4,000 meters. It is the largest living space on Earth by volume, and it is home to the most famous deep-sea giant of all, Architeuthis ducks, the giant squid. For most of human history, it existed only in legend, in the accounts of sailors who described tentacled monsters capable of dragging ships beneath the waves, in the scars found on the bodies of sperm whales, ring-shaped marks left by suckers edged with small teeth. The first scientifically confirmed specimens did not appear until the 19th century, when dead and dying individuals began washing ashore in Newfoundland and New Zealand. Even then, much of what was known came from dead animals, from preserved specimens in museum jars, from the beaks found in the stomachs of sperm whales. A living giant squid in its natural habitat was not photographed until 2004, when a Japanese research team using a baited camera rig at 900 meters depth in the Pacific captured the first images. Video of a living giant squid in the wild was not obtained until 2012. The animal that dominated the mythology of the sea for centuries remained almost entirely unknown to science until the 21st century. What we know now is this. Architeuthis ducks reaches lengths of at least 13 meters for females, which are significantly larger than males. Its mantle, the main body, reaches up to 2 meters in length. The remaining length comes from the 2 long tentacles, which are proportionally longer than the 8 arms and are used to seize prey at distance. Its eyes are the largest of any animal on Earth, reaching 30 centimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a dinner plate. The size of those eyes is not incidental. In the deep ocean, where bioluminescence is the only available light, an eye that can detect a single photon of bioluminescent light against absolute darkness is an eye that can see a predator or a prey item at a distance that a smaller eye could not. The giant squid's eyes are an arms race made visible, the product of millions of years of evolutionary pressure between the squid and its primary predator, the sperm whale. The sperm whale hunts giant squid in the midnight zone. This is a fact that is known with certainty because giant squid beaks are found in sperm whale stomachs in significant quantities, and because sperm whales bear the circular scars of giant squid suckers on their skin. What is not known with certainty is how the hunt proceeds. Sperm whales dive to depths of at least 2,000 meters, possibly deeper, on breath-hold dives lasting up to 90 minutes. They navigate and hunt using echolocation, producing clicks of up to 230 decibels that are the loudest sounds produced by any animal. In the darkness of the midnight zone, the whale finds the squid by sound. The squid presumably detects the whale, though whether by hearing the clicks, by sensing pressure waves, or by some other mechanism is not fully established. What happens when they meet is a question that no camera has ever answered. The battle between the largest toothed predator and the largest invertebrate on Earth has been inferred from evidence but never observed. The midnight zone keeps its most dramatic events entirely private. The colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni, deserves mention here because it is frequently confused with the giant squid and because the confusion matters. The colossal squid is not longer than the giant squid, but it is heavier. Its mantle is broader and more muscular. Its arms and tentacles are shorter relative to its body, but armed differently. Instead of sucker rings, it has sharp rotating hooks, swiveling on the end of each sucker stalk, that can rotate independently and tear flesh. A specimen caught in 2007 weighed 495 kilograms and had a mantle length of 2.5 meters. It is thought to be the largest invertebrate on Earth by mass. It lives primarily in Antarctic waters, at depths between 1,000 and 2,200 meters. And it is even less studied than the giant squid, because its habitat is more remote and the depths it occupies are more difficult to access. The number of complete specimens ever recovered can be counted on two hands. Most of what is known about it comes from beaks found in sperm whale stomachs and from the few partial specimens that have been accidentally caught in deep-sea fishing operations targeting Patagonian toothfish. The midnight zone also contains the siphonophore, though the largest species extend throughout the water column and will be addressed more fully in the next descent. What is worth noting here is that the bathypelagic siphonophores, particularly Irena and related genera, use red bioluminescence rather than the blue-green bioluminescence, typical of most deep-sea organisms. This matters because most deep-sea animals cannot see red light. Their visual systems are tuned to blue-green wavelengths, which are the wavelengths that penetrate deepest in seawater and that most bioluminescent organisms produce. A predator that uses red bioluminescence is essentially using an invisible light, a private frequency that its prey cannot detect. The Irena siphonophore dangles red bioluminescent lures from its tentacles to attract prey that cannot see the red light as a warning signal. It is a weapon that works precisely because the prey's sensory system has been optimized for a different environment. The midnight zone is full of this kind of evolutionary one-upmanship, adaptations that exploit the specific blind spots of other adaptations. The fish of the midnight zone have taken gigantism in directions that the mesopelagic fish have not. The oarfish, for all its length, retains a body plan that is recognizably fish-like. The deep-sea fish of the bathypelagic zone have departed from that template in more radical ways. The fangtooth, Anoplogaster cornuta, has teeth proportionally larger than those of any other fish in the ocean. The teeth are so long that the fish cannot close its mouth fully, and the lower jaw teeth fit into specialized pockets in the upper jaw to prevent them from piercing the fish's own brain when the mouth is shut. The black dragonfish, Ediacanthus atlanticus, produces far red bioluminescence like the Irena siphonophore, giving it a private searchlight that illuminates its prey while remaining invisible to them. The stoplight loosejaw, Malacosteus niger, can dislocate its jaw so dramatically that it can swallow prey nearly its own size, a necessary adaptation in a zone where meals are rare and every opportunity must be fully exploited. These are not large fish in the absolute sense. Most bathypelagic fish are 10 to 30 centimeters long, small relative to the squid they share the zone with. But their adaptations represent a kind of gigantism of feature rather than gigantism of body, an exaggeration of specific anatomical elements, teeth, eyes, jaws, light-producing organs, to sizes that are extreme relative to the rest of the body. This is what happens when evolution optimizes relentlessly for a single function. The fangtooth does not need to be large to be a lethal predator. It needs teeth, so it has teeth. The dragonfish does not need large eyes to use its private red searchlight. It needs the searchlight and a detector tuned to the right frequency, so it has those. The midnight zone produces giants of proportion as readily as giants of scale. What the midnight zone does not contain, as far as we know, is any large animal that is not a predator or a scavenger. The food web here has no herbivores, no filter feeders of significant size, no animals making their living from primary production. Everything that lives here either eats something else or eats what falls from above. The marine snow that reaches 2,000 meters is a thin and unpredictable supply, processed multiple times on its way down. The animals that depend on it are few in number and widely dispersed, and the animals that eat those animals are fewer still. The midnight zone is a sparse world, its giants separated by enormous distances of dark water, finding each other by bioluminescence and chemical signal and sound. The loneliness of the deep, if we can call it that, is most acute here. A giant squid drifting through 2,000 meters of dark water, its dinner plate eyes scanning for the blue-green flash of bioluminescence, its arms trailing, its mantle gently pulsing for propulsion, is an animal that may go days or weeks without encountering anything it can eat. When it does encounter something, the encounter is total. The squid commits everything to it. The midnight zone does not permit half measures. And below it, in the abyss that begins at 4,000 meters, neither does anything else. The sperm whale is not a resident of the midnight zone. It is a visitor, descending from the surface on breath-hold dives to hunt within it and returning to breathe. But its visits are so consequential, so frequent, and so deeply intertwined with the biology of the midnight zone that it belongs in any account of the zone's giants. A single adult sperm whale consumes roughly a ton of squid per day. Multiplied across a global population of several 100,000 animals, this represents an enormous predatory pressure on the cephalopod populations of the deep ocean and an equally enormous transfer of organic matter from the deep back to the surface in the form of whale feces, which are produced at the surface after each dive and represent a significant input of nutrients to the sunless zone. The sperm whale is not merely a predator. It is a pump, moving material from the midnight zone to the surface in quantities that matter to the global nutrient cycle. Its dives connect the two worlds that the 1,000-meter boundary otherwise separates. The physiology that allows a sperm whale to dive to 2,000 meters and remain there for up to 90 minutes on a single breath is itself a kind of gigantism, a scaling up of biological systems to levels that have no equivalent in shallower water marine mammals. Its blood can carry oxygen at concentrations that would be toxic to a human. Its muscles are so saturated with myoglobin, the protein that stores oxygen in muscle tissue, that they are nearly black. Its rib cage is flexible enough to collapse completely under pressure without injury, allowing the lungs to compress without trapping air that would cause the bends on ascent. Its spermaceti organ, the massive structure of waxy oil in its enormous head that gives the species its name, may function as a buoyancy control device, changing density by regulating the temperature of the oil with circulating blood. The sperm whale has been shaped by the midnight zone's demands as thoroughly as the giant squid has been shaped by the need to avoid the sperm whale. Each one is the other's evolutionary pressure. Each one is the reason the other is what it is. The giant squid's ink is worth a brief mention because it is another example of adaptation pushed to extremes. All squid produce ink as a defensive measure, ejecting a dark cloud to confuse predators. The giant squid's ink contains compounds, including tyrosinase, that may interfere with chemical sensing in some predators. In the deep ocean, where chemical detection is often as important as vision, an ink that disrupts sensory systems rather than merely obscuring sight could be a more effective defensive weapon. Whether this is specifically effective against sperm whales, whose olfactory systems are limited, remains unclear. What is clear is that the ink is deployed under extreme conditions in encounters that are themselves almost entirely unobserved. This specificity, this fine-tuning of defensive mechanisms to the exact capabilities of the animals that pose the greatest threat is characteristic of evolution in the deep ocean, where the interactions between species have been running for millions of years without interruption. The midnight zone has a geological timescale. Many of its inhabitants have lineages that extend back to the Cretaceous or earlier, to times when the continents were in different positions and the global ocean had a different circulation pattern. The giant squid's ancestors were present in a recognizable form before the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. The sperm whale's ancestors entered the ocean from the land only about 35 million years ago, a relative newcomer. And yet, in that 35 million years, the sperm whale has evolved to be so thoroughly adapted to the deep ocean that its physiology is unrecognizable from the terrestrial mammals it descended from. The midnight zone does this. It takes whatever enters it and reshapes it according to its own imperatives. The results, after millions of years, are animals that seem to belong to a different biological reality than the one at the surface. They do belong to a different reality. The same water, the same chemistry, the same physics, but scaled and pressured and chilled into something that the surface world's categories are not adequate to contain. And below the midnight zone, at 4,000 meters and beyond, the pressure continues. Literally and figuratively, the abyss is waiting, and the giants that live there have had even longer to become what they are. There is a question that the midnight zone forces you to confront, one that does not arise in the twilight zone above it, where the animals at least maintain a daily connection to the surface world. The question is this: What does it mean to be a giant in a zone where you can go weeks without seeing another living thing? The oarfish in the mesopelagic zone, despite its solitary habits, lives in a zone dense enough with life that encounters are relatively frequent. The giant squid in the midnight zone may drift through thousands of cubic meters of empty dark water between meals and between meetings with others of its kind. Its size, which is so impressive when measured against the scale of the human body, is almost invisible against the scale of its actual environment. And one meter squid in 2,000 meters of open water is tiny. The water dwarfs it completely. This changes how you think about deep-sea gigantism in the midnight zone. The giants here are not large relative to their environment. No animal is large relative to the ocean. They are large relative to their prey and their predators. The giant squid's 13 meters make it capable of catching prey that a smaller squid could not, and make it harder for the sperm whale to swallow whole, necessitating a more prolonged and costly encounter. The size is an advantage in the immediate context of the hunt, not in the broader context of the ocean. And the ocean's indifference to that advantage is part of what makes the midnight zone so philosophically strange. The animals here are competing intensely, evolving rapidly in the evolutionary sense, producing extraordinary adaptations. And all of this is happening in a darkness so complete and a silence so profound that none of it is visible from outside. The midnight zone conducts its dramas entirely without an audience. It has done so for millions of years. The giant squid did not need us to discover it to become what it is. It was already there, already enormous, already locking itself in evolutionary struggle with an animal as extraordinary as itself, in water no one had ever seen. The discovery did not change it. Only our understanding changed. And even that understanding is partial, fragmentary. A few photographs and video clips and dead specimens against the full reality of an animal living its entire life in water we cannot easily reach. The midnight zone has revealed the giant squid to us reluctantly, one piece at a time, over more than a century of effort. What it has not revealed, what remains entirely unknown, is what the giant squid's life actually looks like from the inside, how it experiences the dark, what it perceives with those enormous eyes in water where there is almost nothing to see. The midnight zone keeps that to itself. And below the midnight zone, the ocean keeps still more. The bioluminescence of the midnight zone deserves one final observation before we descend further. In the mesopelagic zone, bioluminescence is common but not universal. In the midnight zone, it is nearly ubiquitous. Estimates suggest that more than 90% of animals in the bathypelagic zone produce light. This is not a coincidence. In a zone where there is no ambient light whatsoever, where the only way to see or be seen is to produce light, bioluminescence is not an optional adaptation. It is the primary medium of communication, predation, defense, and reproduction. The midnight zone has built an entire visual culture out of chemistry. Every flash and glow and pulse carries information. Here is food. Here is a predator. Here is a potential mate. Here is a decoy. Reading that information and producing the right responses to it is the central cognitive challenge of life in the midnight zone. The giant squid's enormous eyes evolved to read it. The dragonfish's private red searchlight evolved to circumvent it. The siphonophore's red lure evolved to exploit it. And all of it, the entire visual language of the midnight zone, is written in light produced by living organisms in water that the sun has never touched. It is a language we are only beginning to learn. And the deeper you go from here, the more completely that language becomes the only one that matters. At 4,000 meters, you have passed through every zone that retains any meaningful connection to the surface world. The midnight zone, despite its name and its darkness, is still part of the open ocean, still part of the water column that links the surface to the deep. Below 4,000 meters, you enter the abyssal zone, and the ocean floor is no longer a distant abstraction. It is close. The abyssal plain, the vast flat expanse of sediment that covers most of the ocean floor, between 4,000 and 6,000 meters, is one of the largest habitats on Earth. It covers more than half of the planet's surface. Almost nothing lives there that you would recognize from the surface world, and some of what lives there is very large indeed, in ways that are quieter and stranger than the giants of the zones above. The giant isopod, Bathynomus giganteus, is the first thing most people think of when they think of abyssal gigantism, and with good reason. It is a crustacean related to the common pillbug or woodlouse that you might find under a rock in any garden in the temperate world. The pillbug is approximately 1.5 centimeters long. Bathynomus giganteus reaches lengths of up to 50 centimeters and weights of up to 1.7 kilograms. It lives primarily at bathyal and abyssal depths between 170 and 2,000 meters, though related species extend deeper. It is recognizably the same body plan as the pillbug, the same segmented oval form, the same jointed legs, the same ability to roll into a protective ball when threatened, but scaled up by a factor of 30 or more into something that looks like a prop from a science fiction film, a creature that exists at the precise intersection of familiar and deeply alien. It has compound eyes that are among the largest of any isopod species. Its exoskeleton is thick and heavily calcified. Its mouth parts are adapted for both scavenging and active predation. It can survive without food for extraordinary periods, months, or possibly years, by drastically reducing its metabolic rate during lean times and relying on fat reserves accumulated during the occasional feast. The giant isopod is a scavenger primarily, drawn to carcasses that sink from above. When a whale falls, the event is called a whale fall, and it represents an enormous input of organic matter to the abyssal ecosystem, a concentrated package of fat, protein, and bone that can sustain a community of scavengers and decomposers for years or decades. Giant isopods are among the first arrivals at a whale fall. They have been filmed swarming over baited traps lowered to abyssal depths, hundreds of them converging on a food source within hours of its arrival, consuming it with a thoroughness that leaves very little behind. Their ability to locate food at great distances, following chemical gradients through still, cold water, is one of their primary adaptations to the feast or famine economy of the abyss. They do not know when the next meal will arrive. They eat as much as they can when it does. The giant isopod's size relative to its surface-dwelling relatives is one of the clearest demonstrations of deep-sea gigantism in the fossil record. Isopods have existed for at least 300 million years, and their body plan has changed remarkably little in that time. The deep-sea lineages that gave rise to Bathynomus giganteus diverged from shallower water relatives at some point in the geological past and proceeded under the selection pressures of cold water, scarce food, and the absence of the size constraints that operate in shallow environments to become progressively larger. The result is an animal that looks like a trilobite brought back to life, ancient in its body plan, extreme in its dimensions, perfectly adapted to an environment that most surface organisms would not survive for minutes. The Greenland shark, Somniosus microcephalus, is not strictly an abyssal animal. It ranges from the surface to depths of at least 2,200 meters, and it is found primarily in the cold, deep waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic. But it belongs in any account of deep-sea gigantism because it represents the extreme end of a different dimension of size, time. The Greenland shark grows to lengths of up to 7 meters and weights of up to 1,400 kilograms. It is the largest fish in the Arctic Ocean, but its most extraordinary attribute is not its size. It is its age. Radiocarbon dating of the crystalline lens proteins of Greenland sharks, proteins that are laid down in layers during development and are not subsequently replaced, has established that the largest individuals are approximately 400 years old, with some estimates extending to 500 years or more. A 500-year-old Greenland shark was alive when Shakespeare was writing his plays, when the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic, when the 30 Years' War reshaped Europe. It has been swimming through cold, dark water for 5 centuries, growing slowly, reproducing rarely, accumulating whatever experience a shark can accumulate over that span of time. The Greenland shark's longevity is a direct consequence of the cold water it inhabits. At the temperatures of the deep North Atlantic, its metabolic rate is so low that growth is measured in centimeters per year. Reproduction does not begin until the animal is roughly 150 years old, and the biological processes of aging proceed at a pace that makes the century-long lifespan of the Japanese spider crab seem brief. Sexual maturity at 150 years means that a Greenland shark born today will not reproduce until the year 2176. The implications for population dynamics are significant. A species that reproduces so slowly and lives so long is extraordinarily vulnerable to overharvesting, because the removal of a breeding adult represents a loss that the population cannot easily replace. Greenland sharks have been caught as bycatch in Arctic fisheries for centuries, and their populations have declined substantially. Conservation efforts have increased in recent decades, but the slow reproductive rate means that recovery, if it occurs, will be measured in generations that span centuries. The abyssal plain also contains the giant sea spider, members of the order Pycnogonida, which are not true spiders, but arthropods of a separate lineage that superficially resemble spiders in their body plan. Surface-dwelling pycnogonids are tiny, typically a few millimeters in body length, with leg spans of a centimeter or two. The abyssal and polar species reach leg spans of 70 centimeters or more. They move slowly across the seafloor on their long, thin legs, feeding primarily on cnidarians, sea anemones, soft corals, hydroids, using a proboscis to suck out the soft tissues. Their circulatory and respiratory systems are so simple that gas exchange occurs largely through diffusion across the body surface, which is possible because their bodies are so thin relative to their size that the diffusion distance is manageable even without gills or lungs. The giant sea spider is an animal that has essentially solved the problem of oxygen transport by becoming thin. Its gigantism is a gigantism of leg span, not of body mass. The Dumbo octopus, genus Grimpoteuthis, represents yet another expression of abyssal gigantism. Named for the ear-like fins on either side of its mantle that it uses for propulsion, the Dumbo octopus typically reaches 20 to 30 centimeters, though at least one individual of approximately 1.8 meters has been recorded, making it among the largest octopus species known. It lives at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 meters, deeper than any other known octopus, and it feeds on worms, bivalves, and crustaceans found in and on the sediment. Unlike most octopuses, which use jet propulsion and are capable of rapid movement, the Dumbo octopus moves slowly and deliberately, flapping its fins in a gentle rhythm that covers ground without expending large amounts of energy. It has no ink sac, having lost the defensive ink that most octopuses use because jet propulsion to escape predators is not part of its behavioral repertoire. At 4,000 meters, there are few predators large enough to threaten it, and the energetic cost of maintaining an ink sac it does not need has been eliminated by evolution. The abyssal plain is not empty. This point cannot be made strongly enough because the image of the deep ocean floor as a barren desert persists despite decades of evidence to the contrary. Trawl surveys of abyssal sediments consistently find more species than expected, more individuals than expected, and more diversity than expected. The sediment itself is alive, packed with bacteria, archaea, meiofauna, the tiny organisms that live between sediment grains, and macrofauna, the larger animals visible to the naked eye. The giant isopod is the most visible representative of this community, but it is not the most abundant. The holothurians, sea cucumbers, are. Some abyssal plains are carpeted with sea cucumbers, hundreds of individuals per square meter in areas of high organic input, plowing through the sediment and processing it for whatever nutrition it contains. They are not giants in the way that the isopod is a giant, but some species reach lengths of half a meter, and their abundance makes them the dominant megafauna of the abyssal plain by biomass. The abyss belongs to the sea cucumber in a way that it does not belong to anything else. The sea cucumber's dominance of the abyssal plain is itself a product of deep-sea gigantism operating at the ecosystem level. The conditions that favor large isopods and long-lived sharks also favor the holothurian body plan, which is essentially a mobile gut, an animal that is mostly digestive system, moving slowly through sediment and extracting nutrition from it with extraordinary efficiency. There is almost no energy wasted on structures that are not directly related to feeding and movement. No elaborate sensory organs, no complex nervous system, no bioluminescence, just a body optimized for processing sediment at the lowest possible energy cost. In an environment where every calorie counts, this is as close to a perfect design as biology produces. The abyssal zone also contains the xenophyophore, which deserves its own moment of attention because it represents gigantism of a kind that has no equivalent anywhere else in the biological world. Xenophyophores are single-celled organisms, members of the group foraminifera, but unlike the tiny shell-secreting foraminifera that are familiar from geological sediment cores, xenophyophores grow to sizes that are visible to the naked eye, and, in some cases, to sizes that are extraordinary even by multicellular standards. Syringamina fragilissima, a xenophyophore found in the North Atlantic, reaches diameters of up to 20 centimeters. It is a single cell, 20 centimeters across, making it one of the largest single cells ever documented. It lives in abyssal sediments, extending its cytoplasm through a branching network of tubes, engulfing sediment particles and extracting whatever nutrition they contain. Its size is achieved not by cell division, the strategy that multicellular organisms use to grow, but by the simple expansion of a single cell's cytoplasm, a strategy that has physical limits, but that, under the conditions of the abyssal zone, apparently reaches sizes that seem to belong to a different category of life entirely. The xenophyophore illustrates something important about deep-sea gigantism that the more familiar examples, the isopod, the shark, the octopus, do not. Gigantism in the deep ocean is not limited to animals. It is not limited to multicellular organisms. It is a response to environmental conditions that operates across the full breadth of life, from single-celled organisms to the largest vertebrates, because the conditions that favor large size operate at every level of biology. Cold water, low metabolism, slow growth, long lifespan, the ability to store energy and survive between feasts. These are advantages for a bacterium, for a single-celled foraminiferal, for a crustacean, for a shark. The strategy scales. The deep ocean does not select for largeness specifically. It selects for the traits that produce largeness as a consequence, and those traits are advantageous regardless of what kind of organism is being shaped. The abyssal plane is also where the full weight of geological time becomes apparent in a way that it does not in the zones above. The sediment at 4,000 to 6,000 meters depth has been accumulating for millions of years, layer by layer, each millimeter 1,000 years of marine snow compressed and preserved. The organisms that live in and on this sediment are living on top of a geological record that extends back through the entire history of the ocean. Below them, in the sediment, are the shells of organisms that lived when the continents were in different positions, when the ocean had a different chemistry, when the climate was different enough that the deep water circulation patterns were fundamentally altered. The abyssal floor is a library written in calcium carbonate and silica, and the animals that live on its surface are, in a sense, living on top of their own history, on top of the accumulated record of every organism that has lived and died in the overlying ocean since the sediment began to accumulate. The giant isopod plowing through this sediment is not merely an animal feeding. It is a geological agent, mixing the layers, disrupting the record, participating in the chemistry of an archive that will outlast it by millions of years. The Greenland shark's relationship to geological time is worth returning to because it adds a dimension to the concept of deep-sea gigantism that the other examples do not. A 500-year-old Greenland shark is not merely old by animal standards, it is old by historical standards. It has been alive through events that human beings record in their history books, through the rise and fall of empires, through the transformation of the global environment by industrial activity, through the warming of the oceans and the acidification that has occurred since the 19th century. It has experienced, in its slow, cold-blooded way, changes to its environment that no other living vertebrate has witnessed. Whether it can be said to remember those changes in any meaningful sense is a question that the neuroscience of sharks cannot answer. But its body carries the record. The isotopic composition of its tissues reflects the chemistry of the ocean at the time those tissues were formed. The oldest layers of its lens proteins were laid down in water that existed before the Industrial Revolution, before the burning of fossil fuels began changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean. The shark is an archive as much as the sediment is an archive. Both are keeping records that humans have only recently learned to read. There is one more abyssal giant worth mentioning, one that rarely appears in popular accounts, but that represents an extreme form of size achieved through a mechanism no other animal uses. The giant barrel sponge, Existospongia testudinaria, reaches heights of 2 meters and diameters of more than 1 meter at abyssal and deep reef depths throughout the Indo-Pacific. Some individuals are estimated to be more than 2,000 years old. Sponges have no tissues, no organs, no nervous system. They are aggregates of cells that filter seawater for food particles. In the deep ocean, where currents are gentle and physical disturbance is rare, a sponge can grow without interruption for centuries. The result is a structure of extraordinary size built by organisms with no more complexity than a layer of cells, in a place where the patience of the ocean and the patience of biology have converged on the same answer. Grow slowly, grow steadily, and given enough time, grow very large. That answer is the Hadal Zone's answer too. But in the Hadal Zone, the question is harder. What the Abyssal Zone teaches, ultimately, is that size in the deep ocean is not a single phenomenon. It is a collection of phenomena, each one produced by a different combination of evolutionary pressures acting on a different lineage over a different timescale, each one solving a different problem in a different way. The giant isopod is large because it is a feast and famine specialist in a zone where feasts are rare and famines are long. The Greenland shark is large because it is cold and slow and old, in a zone where cold and slow and old are advantages. The Xenophile 4 is large because it is a single cell that has found a way to grow beyond the limits that most single cells encounter in a zone where those limits are relaxed by the specific chemistry of the deep. The Dumbo octopus is large because the absence of predators at its depth removes the constraints that keep octopuses smaller in shallower water. None of these are the same answer to the same question. They are different answers to related questions asked by the same indifferent environment of every organism that has ever descended into it. The abyss does not care about the answers. It simply presents the conditions, and evolution finds a way, in the time available, to produce something that works. Below the abyss, where the Hadal Zone begins, the conditions become more extreme still, and the answers evolution finds there are stranger than anything the abyss has produced. Below 6,000 meters, the ocean floor disappears into the trenches. These are not simply deeper versions of the abyssal plain. They are enclosed valleys, formed by the subduction of tectonic plates, where the geometry of the walls does something that the flat abyssal plain cannot. It concentrates. Marine snow that was spread across thousands of square kilometers of open abyssal sediment instead falls into a narrow funnel, accumulating on the trench floor at densities that are higher than the surrounding plain. Organic matter that slides down the steep walls, triggered by earthquakes that are themselves a product of the subduction process that formed the trench, arrives in concentrated pulses. The Hadal Zone, the zone below 6,000 meters that exists only in trenches, is extreme in every physical parameter, cold, pressurized beyond anything in the zones above, dark with an absoluteness that makes the midnight zone seem twilight by comparison. And yet it is, in certain ways, richer in food than the abyssal plain outside it. The trenches are not deserts. They are funnels. And what the funnels concentrate, evolution has learned to exploit. The siphonophore, Praia dubia, is the longest animal on Earth. Not the heaviest, not the most massive. The longest. A single individual can reach 50 meters from one end to the other, longer than a blue whale, longer than most ships of the era before steel hulls, longer than anything else that has ever lived on this planet, if length is the dimension you're measuring. It is not a single organism in the conventional sense. It is a colony of individual units called zooids, each one genetically identical to the others, each one specialized for a different function within the colony. Some zooids are responsible for propulsion, pulsing rhythmically to move the colony through the water. Others are responsible for feeding, trailing stinging tentacles that capture prey. Others handle reproduction. Others provide structural support. The colony as a whole behaves like a single animal, but it is in fact a superorganism, a collective that has divided the labor of existence among its members so thoroughly that no individual zooid could survive on its own. Praia dubia lives primarily in the mesopelagic and bathopelagic zones, trailing its 50-meter body through the darkness and harvesting prey over an enormous volume of water. But related siphonophores extend into hadal depths, and the siphonophore body plan, which has remained fundamentally unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, is one of the deep ocean's most successful strategies for achieving large size at low metabolic cost. The colony grows by adding new zooids. It does not need to grow a single large body with all the energetic demands that entails. It grows a distributed body, a network, each unit small and energetically cheap, the whole capable of reaching sizes that no single organism could maintain. It is gigantism achieved through architecture rather than through physiology. The deep ocean found a way to be enormous without being expensive. The Hadal snailfish, genus Pseudoliparus, holds the record for the deepest fish ever recorded. In 2023, a snailfish was filmed at 8,336 meters in the Izu Ogasawara Trench near Japan, breaking the previous depth record. Specimens have been captured at similar depths in the Mariana Trench. The snailfish is not a giant by the standards of the zones above. It is a small fish, typically 20 to 30 centimeters long, pale and translucent, with no scales, no swim bladder, and no obvious armor against the pressure that surrounds it. What makes it remarkable is not its size, but its depth, and what its presence at that depth reveals about the limits of vertebrate biology. Most fish cannot survive below approximately 8,400 meters because the concentration of trimethylamine oxide, the molecule that counteracts the effects of pressure on proteins, reaches toxic levels before the pressure limit is reached. The snailfish appears to be approaching this limit, and researchers believe it may represent the deepest possible depth for any fish, the absolute physiological boundary of what the vertebrate body plan can achieve. The snailfish is not a giant, but in the context of the Hadal Zone, it is extraordinary for a different reason. It is a vertebrate. The Hadal Zone was long assumed to be beyond the reach of fish, a realm of invertebrates and microbes only. The discovery of snailfish at Hadal depths rewrote that assumption and raised new questions about what other vertebrates might be present in the trenches and what physiological adaptations allow them to be there. The snailfish's body is filled with a high concentration of TMAO and other osmolytes that keep its proteins functional under pressure. Its cell membranes are enriched in polyunsaturated fatty acids that remain fluid at high pressure and low temperature. It has, in effect, solved the same problems that every deep-sea organism has solved, using the same toolkit applied to a body plan that most biologists assumed could not be adapted for such extremes. The Hadal Zone proved them wrong. It usually does. The amphipod crustaceans of the Hadal Zone represent the invertebrate version of this story. Hirundella gigas and related species have been found at the very bottom of the Mariana Trench, at depths exceeding 10,000 meters. They are small animals, a few centimeters long, but they are present in extraordinary densities. Baited traps lowered to Hadal depths have returned filled with thousands of amphipods, far more than anyone expected in an environment that seems so inhospitable. The amphipods are scavengers, swarming over any organic matter that reaches the trench floor, consuming it with the same thoroughness that the giant isopod brings to whale falls in shallower water. What makes the Hadal amphipods remarkable is not their individual size, but their abundance. In a zone where the physical conditions seem designed to prevent life, they exist in numbers that would be impressive in far more hospitable environments. The Hadal Zone does not simply tolerate life. In certain respects, it concentrates it. The Hadal amphipod's body contains extraordinary concentrations of polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly omega-3 fatty acids that keep its membranes functional under Hadal pressure. These fatty acids are ultimately derived from surface ocean photosynthesis, passed through the food chain, carried to the trench floor in the bodies of organisms that sank from above, and incorporated into the amphipod's tissues when it feeds. The chemistry of the Hadal Zone is continuous, with the chemistry of the surface ocean, separated by 10,000 meters of water, but linked by the slow rain of organic matter and the cycling of essential molecules through the food web. The amphipod at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is, in a chemical sense, connected to the phytoplankton blooming in the sunlit water above it. The deep ocean is not separate from the surface. It is the surface's downstream. The xenophyophores of the Hadal zone are the largest single-celled organisms ever recorded at any depth. Xenophyophores in the abyssal zone reach 20 centimeters. In the Hadal zone, on the slopes and floor of the Challenger Deep, related species have been recorded at comparable dimensions, thriving in conditions that exceed anything in the abyss above. Their ability to function at Hadal pressure is a product of the same molecular adaptations that allow every other Hadal organism to exist there. Cell membranes enriched in the right lipids, proteins stabilized by the right structural features, metabolic pathways adjusted to operate at the right temperature. But the xenophyophore achieves these adaptations in a single cell without the division of labor that multicellular organisms use to manage complexity. It is the simplest possible solution to the most extreme possible environment, a single cell doing everything at 10,000 meters depth in the cold and the dark, undisturbed. What the Hadal zone ultimately represents in the context of the story of deep-sea gigantism is both a limit and a continuation. It is a limit because some forms of gigantism cannot reach it. Fish approach the Hadal zone but cannot enter most of it. The largest cephalopods stay above it. The Greenland shark does not dive to 10,000 meters. The Hadal zone is a zone that selects against certain body plans and certain sizes. The zone where the extreme conditions impose costs that even deep-sea adaptation cannot fully offset. But it is also a continuation because the organisms that do live there, the amphipods, the snailfish, the xenophyophores, the bacteria, are expressions of the same evolutionary logic that has produced giants at every depth above. Cold, slow, patient, long-lived, adapted for scarcity, and optimized for the occasional feast. The Hadal zone takes these principles further than any other environment on Earth, and the organisms it produces are the most extreme expressions of what the deep ocean selection pressures can achieve. The rule that began at 150 meters with a crab the size of a car ends here at 10,000 meters in the cold and the absolute dark, with organisms that are not large by the standards of the zones above, but that represent the outer limit of what life can do with the conditions the deep ocean provides. The deeper you go, the bigger things get, up to a point. Then the conditions become so extreme that size itself becomes a liability, and evolution finds other solutions. Smaller bodies, simpler cells, microbial communities that process whatever arrives with a patience that makes the Greenland shark's 5-century lifespan seem brief. The ocean does not run out of surprises at any depth. It simply changes what it is surprising about. And at the deepest point on Earth, the surprise is not the size of what lives there. It is that anything lives there at all. That is always the surprise, at every depth, in every zone. That life found a way. That it keeps finding ways. That the deeper you go, the more ways it has found. In conditions that no surface world logic could have predicted and that the deep ocean does not explain, but simply presents in the cold and the dark as fact. The question of what sets the upper limit on size in the Hadal Zone is one that deep-sea biologists have only recently begun to investigate seriously. The intuitive answer is pressure, but pressure alone does not explain the pattern. The molecular adaptations that allow organisms to function at Hadal depths, the TMAO, the unsaturated fatty acids, the pressure-stable proteins, can, in principle, be extended further. What limits them is not the physical impossibility of the adaptations, but the metabolic cost of accumulating and maintaining them. At some point, the energetic investment required to keep proteins functional under extreme pressure exceeds the energy available from the food arriving at that depth. The food chain thins with depth. The organic matter that reaches 10,000 meters is a tiny fraction of what left the surface, and building a large body requires energy that the Hadal Zone, concentrated as it is relative to the surrounding abyss, simply cannot supply in sufficient quantity for a large vertebrate or a large invertebrate that is not a specialist scavenger. The giant amphipod Alicella gigantea, found at Hadal and abyssal depths throughout the Pacific, reaches lengths of up to 34 centimeters, making it one of the largest amphipods known. It is not as large as the giant isopod, but it is an amphipod, a group that, at the surface, is represented by creatures a centimeter or two long, and 34 centimeters is a dramatic departure from that baseline. Alicella gigantea has been caught in baited traps at depths of more than 7,000 meters, well within the Hadal Zone, and it appears to be one of the top invertebrate predators and scavengers at those depths, capable of consuming prey items nearly its own size. It demonstrates that the trend toward larger size with increasing depth, the rule that began with the Japanese spider crab at 150 meters, has not entirely reversed even at 7,000 meters. It has slowed, become patchier, more dependent on specific local conditions. But it has not stopped. The bacterial communities of the Hadal Zone deserve attention here because they represent a form of deep-sea gigantism that operates at a scale invisible to the naked eye, but enormous in its collective impact. Individual Hadal bacteria are not large, but the communities they form in the sediment of the Hadal Zone, the biofilms and mats that cover the trench floor, are among the most metabolically active microbial communities in the deep ocean. They process organic matter with an efficiency that is extraordinary given the conditions, operating at temperatures near freezing, under pressures exceeding 1,000 atmospheres, in the near total absence of oxygen in some sediment layers. The diversity of metabolic strategies represented in a single gram of Hadal sediment is greater than the diversity of metabolic strategies in the entire surface biosphere. The Hadal Zone has had millions of years to experiment with biochemistry in isolation from the surface, and it has produced solutions to the problem of extracting energy from matter that have no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. The isolation of the Hadal Zone is worth dwelling on. Each major trench is, to a significant extent, a separate ecosystem. The Mariana Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Kermadec Trench, the Japan Trench, Each one has its own community of hadal organisms, shaped by its own local geology, its own pattern of organic matter input, its own history of geological activity. Species found in one trench are not always found in others. The amphipods of the Mariana Trench are related to, but distinct from the amphipods of the Kermadec Trench. The hadal zone is not a single environment. It is a collection of isolated extreme environments, each one an evolutionary experiment conducted in isolation, each one producing its own version of the answers to the questions that the deep ocean asks. The giants that emerge from each trench are products of their particular conditions, not of a single universal deep-sea process. The rule is real. Deeper means different, and different means extreme. But the specific expressions of that rule vary between trenches in ways that scientists are only beginning to map. What does it feel like, if you can call it feeling, to be at the bottom of the Mariana Trench? The animals there have no concept of the surface, no memory of light, no awareness of the 11,000 meters of water above them, or the crushing pressure that their molecular adaptations have made invisible to their physiology. They live in their environment the way every organism lives in its environment, as though it were the only environment that exists, as though its conditions were the definition of normal. The amphipod swarming over a piece of organic matter on the trench floor is not experiencing hardship. It is experiencing its life. The pressure that would kill a human being in an instant is, to the amphipod, simply the world. The cold that would incapacitate any surface organism is, to the snailfish, simply the temperature. The darkness that would leave a human disoriented and terrified is, to every animal in the hadal zone, simply the absence of a sense that was never relevant to begin with. The deep ocean is not an extreme environment from the perspective of the organisms that live in it. It is home. The extremity is entirely in the eye of the observer, which is to say, in us, standing at the surface, looking down into water we cannot enter, at a scale of depth we cannot intuitively comprehend, at life that does not know we are watching. The story of deep-sea gigantism, told from the surface to the hadal zone, is ultimately a story about what happens when you remove the constraints. The surface ocean is full of constraints on size, visible predators, warm water that demands high metabolic rates, competition for food in a zone rich enough to support many competitors, physical limits imposed by the density and temperature of the water. Remove those constraints, one by one, as you descend through the water column, and the result is the organisms we have been describing. The Japanese spider crab, freed from the warmer water that would demand a higher metabolic rate, grows to 3 times the leg span of its tropical relatives. The oarfish, freed from the horizontal swimming demands of the sunlit zone, develops a body plan that would be impossible in a world that required speed. The giant squid, freed from the visual predators that make large eyes a liability in clear water, evolves eyes the size of dinner plates. The Greenland shark, freed from the competitive pressures that shorten the lives of its temperate cousins, lives for 5 centuries. The xenophyophore, freed from the physical disturbances that limit cell size in shallow water, expands a single cell to the breadth of a human hand. Each giant is, at its core, a constraint removed. Each one is evolution, showing what it can do when the usual rules do not apply. And in that showing, the deep ocean does something that the surface world cannot. It demonstrates the outer limits of what biology is capable of, what forms life can take when time and patience and the absence of the usual pressures are the only inputs. The deep ocean has been running this experiment for hundreds of millions of years, mostly without our awareness, producing its giants in the dark, in the cold, in the silence. We have known about most of them for less than a century. We have seen living individuals of most species only in the last few decades. And there are certainly species down there, in the midnight zone and the abyss and the Hadal trenches, that no human being has ever observed, that no camera has ever captured, that exist as complete biological realities in the dark water without any reference to us at all. The deep ocean is not finished surprising us. It has barely started. Let that thought settle as you drift toward sleep now, toward the slow, patient dark that the deep ocean knows so well. You are a surface creature, warm and lit and fast. But the ocean below you is vast, and what lives in it is extraordinary, and it has been there, in the cold and the silence, for longer than you can imagine. It will be there still when the light comes back. The deeper you go, the bigger things get, and the ocean goes very, very deep. If this journey moved something in you, consider subscribing to Sleep on Deep. Every week we descend a little further. The ocean is waiting.